Hi, Joe.
Hey, everybody say hello.
You're on TV.
Yo estoy justamente en la entrada nacional.
La guerra interminable de Haldeman representó para mí un fuerte impacto. De alguna manera era algo que estaba esperando en la ciencia ficción. Siempre he sido un lector de ciencia ficción y fantasía prácticamente desde los 15 años. Mi padre tuvo el inmenso acierto de poner en la mesita de noche, sin decirme qué era y por qué, Crónicas Marcianas de Bradbury cuando yo tenía 12 años. Y al paso de los días me preguntó qué. Y yo dije, no entiendo nada, es maravilloso. La ciencia ficción representaba una propuesta política para mí. Yo era un lector en las mañanas de la historia de la Revolución Rusa de Trotsky y en las tardes leía Sturgeon, con lo cual era el más listo de todos los lectores de marxismo de mi generación, porque tenía la compensación correcta. La ciencia ficción estaba permanentemente proponiendo de manera explícita, clara, transparente o de manera subterránea, espejo distorsionado de Alicia en el País de las Maravillas, estaba proponiendo una revisión del mundo en el que vivimos, el pensamiento utópico, la propuesta de futuro, la realidad.
My wife and I were both strongly against the war in Vietnam when we were students in the 1960s. Being against the war, of course, did not keep us from getting drafted. And I was drafted as soon as I graduated from college. I thought, well, okay, this would not be a real problem. I was old. I was 24, whereas most soldiers were 18 or 19. And I had 6 years of college, so certainly the Army would find some technological thing for me to do. But I was wrong. They just put me in the jungle with a gun. And that was probably a really bad mistake, because I was a pacifist. And at first I said I wouldn't fight, I wouldn't kill anybody. And they said, okay, but you have to carry a gun, and you can do with it what you want. And you're going to find out that when people are trying to kill you, your politics evaporate. And they were right, of course. You have to have a sort of Gandhi-like saintly attitude toward life, not to try to shoot back at people who are shooting at you. So I became an ex-pacifist, at least technically. I still think it's another terrible sin to kill people, especially for political reasons. But I also have some sympathy for the people who are driven to do it by political force. I was interested in the way he asked me to explain how I came to be a writer. And in fact, I always was a writer from the time I was 9 or 10 years old, in terms of writing poetry. But I never thought about doing it for a living. Of course, nobody writes poetry for a living, at least not in the United States. So I thought I would always do that as a sideline. And, well, I followed my first love, which was astronomy. I would be a scientist who wrote poetry on the side. I realized that I wanted to write a science fiction novel about Vietnam. But the first novel that I published was about war, but it was only about Vietnam. It was not science fiction. So I wrote up the sample chapters and the outline for the Forever War. And I gave them to my agent, and he started sending them to publishers. And after about a year and a half, I went to New York to my agent's office, and he gave me a card of paper with the names of every publisher that had rejected the Forever War. And that night I went to a cocktail party that was thrown by the Science Fiction Writers of America. And all of those publishers were there at that cocktail party. everybody who had rejected my book was there. And I drank a little much before I got there, and might have done something really dangerous. But I met an old friend, the editor Ben Bova, who was publishing the Forever War as short stories in his magazine Analog. And Ben introduced me to the one person in that room who had never, the one editor, who had never published any science fiction. And he and I explained what the Forever War was about, and that guy said, okay, we'll do it. And they became the largest science fiction publisher in the United States. A few years later, after they did the Forever War and made a huge fortune off it, they decided science fiction was worth doing. It was St. Martin's Press.
Yo no lo sabía, pero cuando presenté mi primera novela en Estados Unidos para proponerla, el editor que primero la recibió dijo que nunca sería publicada una novela policíaca de un autor mexicano en traducción en Estados Unidos, y menos un escritor de izquierda. Y resulta que terminó publicando la St. Martin Press también.
That novel did come out, and it won both the Hugo and the Nebula Awards, the major awards in science fiction. And it sort of convinced me that I could become a science fiction writer. Well, I don't think rules as in ABC, things you must do, but there are criteria that you must satisfy. For example, science fiction that does not ask a question in the form of what if, or if this goes on. If it doesn't have one of those questions embedded in it, then maybe it's not really science fiction. I wrote a science fiction book, which, when it came out, was science fiction. But by the time the paperback came out, it was no longer science fiction, because it was about the relations between the United States and Russia. And they changed. My science fiction novel predicted perestroika and sort of cooperation between the United States and Russia, which, when I was writing it, was a fairly daring prediction. By the time the paperback came out, though, it was history.
Además de Hemingway, hay un autor que es inevitable recordar cuando uno lee La Guerra Interminable, y un autor del que me gustaría preguntarle su opinión, Robert Heinlein.
Heinlein was far and away my favorite writer when I was a young man, when I was a boy and a young man. I think that I learned many lessons about life from Heinlein that it took me a lot of living to unlearn. I think that he was a very elegant moralizer, but I think in many cases I believed otherwise after I became older.
I'm wondering if there's a generational element here. Because I can name a whole bunch of writers, both British, American, whatever. They start out as sort of young men with ideals, they're socialists, and all the rest. And in that group you can name Kingsley Amis, and you can also point to a number of other people who came up with a thought that said a young man who isn't a socialist or a liberal has no heart. And then they go on to say, but an older man who doesn't believe in conservative values has no brain.
This is an interesting observation that is often true, but I don't think it's a generalization you can make about all peoples, and not all men, and not all American men. I feel as if I'm more liberal in my views now than I was when I was younger. And now I'm just a bloody anarchist, and anything goes.